Today we will be looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to England. Hannah Brown was born in the spring of 1780 and grew up in a rural market town in the county of Norfolk, in England. She was the second eldest child of a schoolmaster and a seamstress. Her parents instilled in all their children not only the benefits of a solid education, but also essential life skills, emphasising politeness, decency, and a strong work ethic. Hannah was a good-natured child and grew into a pleasant young woman. She was quite tall, about 5 foot 8 inches, had a long pale face and long brown hair, and was known for her friendly and kind disposition. She was always very helpful and seemed to be able to resolve any problems or challenges that she encountered. At the age of 16, she began working as a maid in a large house in Norfolk. After 4 years of service, she decided to move to London. Initially, she supported herself working in domestic service in the city, but eventually she married a gentleman named Mr. Thomas Brown, who worked as a shoemaker. Unfortunately, their marriage was unhappy, and after 2 years, Thomas left to travel to Jamaica, where he intended to claim an inheritance from a deceased relative. Tragically, he was washed overboard during the voyage, and with no knowledge of the specifics of his claim, Hannah was unable to secure the inheritance. She remarried, and life seemed to be improving for her. However, she was unable to conceive and did not have any children. Again, she faced further tragedy when her second husband died. She now found herself widowed for the second time and faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding her life amidst deep grief and uncertainty. Despite the emotional and financial strain, she persevered with remarkable resilience. She began to work as a housekeeper for a gentleman named Mr. Perrin, who was a hatter, and Mr. Oliver, a wealthy gentleman who specialised in the business of making anchors. Although London could be a daunting place, especially for a woman on her own, Hannah possessed a great ability to adapt, and the tragedies that she had experienced in her life had somehow given her the strength and determination to overcome adversity. One day, while working as a housekeeper, she was involved in an accident with a fellow worker. It resulted in her earring being torn out of her left ear, and the wound left a lasting scar. Despite this setback, her determination remained unwavering, and she was eager to improve her circumstances. Wanting to earn more money, she purchased a mangle from a carpenter named Mr. Ward, who lived nearby on Cherney Street, and set herself up in business as a washerwoman. She worked tirelessly, saving every penny she could, and was determined to one day buy her own shop and fulfill her dream of selling a combination of fruits and pastries. In 1836, she met Mr. James Greenacre, a charismatic 42-year-old with a reputation for charm and alleged business success. However, the local people were unsure of the true source of his wealth, and there were those who suspected that it came from less than honest means. Despite the fact that he seemed to be a person who was very good in business, his personal life had been marked by profound sorrow. He told people that he had lost 3 wives and buried 4 out of his 7 children. Of course, when he repeated this sad tale to Hannah, she was able to understand his experiences with grief and loss, and this created a strong connection between them. As they spent more time together, Hannah's empathy towards him grew, allowing her to provide comfort and support amid her own hardships. Hannah seemed to be very much taken by James, and in November 1836, just 3 months after they had first met, he proposed to her. She accepted, believing that she had finally found happiness and the companionship that she had sought for so long. They planned to marry on Christmas Day. James claimed to own farmland in the USA and suggested that Hannah sell all her belongings so they could start their married life together. She was thrilled by the prospect of a fresh beginning and eagerly looked forward to their future. The promise of a chance to build a shared dream filled her with hope and anticipation. In preparation for the wedding, Hannah did as James had asked and sold virtually all of her personal belongings. She informed her landlady, Mrs. Elizabeth Corney, who had also become a good friend, that she was relocating to North America and thus no longer required her possessions. Elizabeth was a little bit upset by the news, but understood Hannah's excitement about her new life. On the afternoon of Saturday the 24th of December 1836, Hannah bid farewell to Mrs. Corney and with a mixture of both hope and nervousness, she told her that there were still some things in her room and that she would send back the key in a couple of days when she had retrieved them. As she climbed into the waiting carriage, a man climbed down and helped place her luggage inside. Elizabeth looked at the man and thought him to be Mr. James Greenacre, someone who she had been introduced to on one previous occasion. But as the carriage rolled away, she felt a sense of concern, somewhat unsure of the new path that Hannah was about to undertake. 4 days later, on the afternoon of the 28th of December, Mr. James White was in Pineapple Place near the Edgware Road when he spotted a large slab of stone leaning against the wall. Behind it, he noticed what initially appeared to be a bag, but upon closer inspection, he realised that it was in fact a Hessian sack, tied with a rope. It seemed to be very much out of place, but as he moved it, he was taken aback as red liquid started seeping from it. He touched the red substance, and as he put his finger to his eye, he feared that it might be blood. Mr. White told his assistant named Robert Bond to find a police officer. The young man hurried off, and soon after, Officer Samuel Pegler arrived at the scene. He looked at the sack before carefully opening it. Inside was the most disturbing sight. The sack contained the torso of a woman, gruesomely severed from both her head and her legs. As he regained his composure, Officer Pegler looked around, and nearby he saw several pieces of cloth that had been scattered about on the ground. Considering the possibility that they might be potentially important to the investigation, he collected them and placed them into a wheelbarrow, along with the sack containing the torso. He then pushed the wheelbarrow back to Paddington Police Station. The torso was inspected by Mr. Girdwood, the surgeon of the district, who made a most minute examination of it. He confirmed that the body was of a female who would have been approximately 50 years of age. He said that from the appearances presented by her arms and hands, she must have been employed in a laborious occupation. The torso was then stored on a table, along with the sack and the cloths. The authorities needed to identify the unfortunate victim, but since no one had reported a missing woman, they were unable to immediately determine her identity. An inquest was held on Saturday the 31st of December at the White Lion Inn on the Edgware Road. Despite examining every witness who might offer the slightest insight into the case, the jury ultimately returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Mr. Girdwood then recorded a detailed description of the body's condition and appearance. During the following week, the body was interred in Paddington Churchyard, though not buried very deeply, in case the head and legs were later discovered and the torso required exhumation. The police decided to concentrate on the sack and took it to people who lived or worked in the vicinity of Edgware Road, where the gruesome discovery was made. Eventually it was recognised by Mr. Evan Davis, a carpenter and upholsterer who resided at 45 Bartholomew Close. He identified the sack by its several holes, which he said had been made by his children while playing inside it. Mr. Davis informed the officers that his work produced large quantities of wood shavings that he then sold on to different people. He said that this sack went to a lady named Miss Hannah Brown, but for some reason he had not seen her for more than a week. He added that he had known her for about 5 years and that she had recently left her residence to be married. The police's attempts to locate Miss Brown, however, were unsuccessful. A week later, on the morning of Friday the 6th of January 1837, a man named Matthias Ralph, who worked as the lock keeper at Johnson's Lock on the Regent's Canal, encountered a troubling issue. He had been informed that the lock gates were not closing properly. Something was blocking them. This was unusual and halted the smooth operation of the canal. Concerned about the obstruction, he went to retrieve a hook to remove whatever was causing the problem. When Mr. Ralph pulled the object from the water, he initially believed it to be a dead dog. However, upon closer inspection, he realised that it was in fact a human head. The head had long dark hair, and one eye was severely damaged. There was also a noticeable scar on the left ear. Mr. Ralph carefully wrapped the head and took it to the local police station. A later autopsy revealed that the victim had suffered a severe and forceful blow to the back of the head. The torso found along the Edgware Road was then exhumed for comparison. After a thorough examination, Mr. Girdwood promptly declared that the head and the torso belonged to the same body. On Thursday the 2nd of February, a man named James Page, who was a labourer working in Cold Harbour Lane between Camberwell and Brixton, was going about his daily tasks when he unexpectedly stumbled on a sack hidden among some bushes. Intrigued and slightly alarmed, he noticed a hole in the sack, which seemed to have a human knee protruding from it. Deeply disturbed, he called over a fellow worker to take a look. The two men then peered inside the sack, and what they saw was far more horrifying than they had imagined. Two severed human legs, crudely hacked from a body. There were jagged cuts and ragged flesh around several areas, which created a gruesome and nauseating scene. Realising the seriousness of their discovery, James Page urgently shouted to a nearby policeman named William Woodward to come over. Constable Woodward, a young and relatively new policeman, carefully examined the contents of the sack. After making sure there was no additional evidence or body parts in the vicinity, he took the sack to the police station for further investigation. The police had already determined that the head and torso that had been previously discovered belonged to the same individual, and once the legs had been delivered to Paddington, it did not take long for them to connect that they were from the same body. They decided to put the head on display, and thousands of people came to see it, seemingly driven by both curiosity and a desire to aid in the pursuit of justice. Despite frequent claims of recognition, no real evidence was obtained to identify the deceased. As the head began to decompose, steps were taken to preserve it. Mr. Girdwood was instructed to take the necessary precautions, and the head was placed in spirits for preservation. It was kept at Mr. Girdwood's residence, available for inspection by anyone who might provide more information about the case. By now, Mrs. Elizabeth Corney had become concerned that Hannah Brown had not collected her remaining belongings or returned her key. She spoke to her husband, a gentleman named Mr. John Corney, who decided to investigate. He went to speak to Mr. Evan Davis to see if he knew where she might be. Mr. Davis informed him that he had not seen or heard from Hannah since before Christmas. However, after speaking to Mr. Corney and hearing the news about the unidentified head that was found at Johnson's Lock, he began to suspect that this grim discovery might be connected to Hannah's disappearance. Deeply concerned, he went to Paddington Police Station and shared his suspicions with the duty officer. He was then escorted to the home of Mr. Girdwood, where he was asked if he was able to identify the head. After a brief inspection, his worst fears were confirmed, as Mr. Davis said that this was indeed the head of Miss Hannah Brown. Around the same time, Miss Brown's brother reported his sister as missing, and when he was shown the head, he too confirmed that it was indeed his sister. Now authorities were certain that the dismembered body was indeed Hannah Brown. They now needed to find who had committed this most horrible crime, and it did not take them long to arrive at Miss Brown's last known residence, which was the home of Mr. John and Mrs. Elizabeth Corney. Mrs. Corney told Inspector George Feltham that she had waved goodbye to Hannah on Saturday the 24th of December 1836, as she was collected in a carriage by a gentleman who she was sure was Hannah's fiancé, Mr. James Greenacre. According to Mrs. Corney, Hannah had been engaged to Mr. Greenacre and was set to marry him on Christmas Day, with plans to then embark on a journey to North America. Inspector Feltham made inquiries as to the whereabouts of Mr. James Greenacre and soon learned that he had recently relocated to a house at St. Albans Place in Lambeth. Determined to pursue this lead, the inspector went to the address and found Mr. Greenacre in the company of a woman named Miss Sarah Gale and a young child of about 4 or 5 years old. He saw boxes and trunks on the floor. It was as if they were about to embark on a long journey, possibly overseas. The inspector ordered his officers to conduct a thorough search of the property, and they soon uncovered some interesting items. Among these were a gold watch, several rings, and other jewellery of value. Many of the things found were later confirmed to have belonged to Hannah Brown. There are also pawn shop receipts for other possessions, which when they looked into were also items that had once belonged to Hannah. The search also uncovered a child's dress, which had been mended with fabric, matching the cloth found near the sack containing the torso. It was also noted that 2 of the rooms appeared to have been carefully scrubbed and cleaned, and that there was a strong smell of brimstone. These discoveries provided critical evidence in the investigation and added to the case against Mr. James Greenacre. Several of the suspects' former neighbours from Carpenter's Place were interviewed and were able to shed more light on his and Miss Sarah Gale's activities. These neighbours revealed that since October of the previous year, Miss Gale had been going about the area telling everyone that she was Mrs. Greenacre, and although everyone knew that the couple were not legally married, they treated them as husband and wife, as they were unaware that James Greenacre had other female acquaintances. The police continued to search Mr. Greenacre's home and came across a saw and a knife, which investigators believed were the ones used to dismember the body. This grisly discovery reinforced the suspicion that Mr. James Greenacre had not only the motive, but also the means to commit this horrific crime. Mr. Greenacre was then charged with the murder of Miss Hannah Brown. The trial at the Central Criminal Court was presided over by Chief Justice Sir Nicholas Tyndall and commenced on Monday the 10th of April 1837. The prosecution was led by John Adolphus and Sir William Henry Bodkin, who presented a compelling case against James Greenacre. They argued that his marriage proposal to Hannah Brown was a mere facade and that he had intended to lure her into a deadly trap. They contended that Mr. Greenacre had neither property nor money and that he had never intended to marry Hannah. Instead, the entire episode was a premeditated plot to rob from her everything that she owned. They claimed that after the murder, the defendant had planned to flee to America with his accomplice, Miss Sarah Gale. The medical evidence presented during the trial became a focal point of intense debate. 3 surgeons, Dr. Gilbert Finley Girdwood, Dr. James Hunter Lane, and Dr. James Birtwistle, testified about the nature of the wounds found on Hannah Brown's body. While there was some disagreement about which injuries occurred before or after death, all 3 surgeons agreed that the wound near Hannah's left eye was inflicted while she was still alive. The prosecution believed that this injury could not have resulted from a simple fall. Instead, they concluded that she had been struck in the face, causing her to fall backwards against a hard surface. Then, believing her to be dead, Mr. Greenacre dismembered her body in a gruesome attempt to conceal the crime. In his defence, James Greenacre admitted to accidentally killing Hannah Brown, claiming it to be following a financial dispute before their planned marriage. He said that he did not mean to injure her, and when he discovered that she was dead, he panicked and dismembered her body to hide the evidence. Mr. Greenacre vehemently denied that Sarah Gale had any involvement in the murder. When the trial ended, the jury deliberated for only 15 minutes before finding Mr. James Greenacre guilty of murder and Miss Sarah Gale guilty of covering up and profiting from a crime. As a result, Mr. Greenacre was sentenced to death, while Sarah Gale was sentenced to transportation for life, a severe punishment that meant she would be sent to a penal colony. While in prison awaiting his execution, Mr. Greenacre showed little interest in spiritual guidance, and although he occasionally read religious texts, most of his time was occupied with writing. In his conversations with visiting officials, he complained about the false stories circulating about his past, particularly the allegation that he had murdered a child that he had had with Miss Gale. He insisted that the child had died a natural death, but admitted to placing it outside the door of a gentleman named Mr. Dale, who lived in Rupert Street in Haymarket, and that after that the child was sent to St. James' Workhouse, where after 9 months she died. Miss Gale corroborated his statement when questioned separately. A few days before his scheduled execution, he wrote 2 letters addressed to his legal assistants, Mr. Price and Mr. Hobler. In these letters, he insisted once again that Miss Brown's death was an accident, and that Miss Gale was entirely innocent of any involvement. Despite his claims of innocence, James Greenacre was hanged outside Newgate Prison in front of a large and boisterous crowd on the 2nd of May 1837. A few months later, Sarah Gale was put on a ship and transported to the colony of New South Wales. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.